For a long time, Daniel believed that stability meant success because nothing was openly broken, nothing had dramatically collapsed, and from the outside, his life looked carefully assembled, with routines that worked, conversations that stayed polite, and days that passed without conflict. Yet somewhere beneath that surface, he began to notice a quiet dullness, not sadness exactly, but the absence of anticipation, the strange realization that he no longer looked forward to anything beyond the end of the day. And this awareness did not arrive all at once, but crept in slowly through small moments, like when he caught himself answering questions automatically without listening, or when silence felt heavier than noise. And he started to wonder how many choices he had made simply because they were expected, how often he had postponed his own curiosity in favor of responsibility, telling himself there would be time later. And as he reflected on the years behind him, he saw not mistakes, but compromises layered so neatly that he had mistaken them for maturity. And this understanding unsettled him because it suggested that nothing dramatic needed to happen for a life to drift off course, that it was possible to lose oneself quietly, politely, while appearing perfectly fine to everyone else. And as this thought settled in, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the numbness. Not panic, not regret, but a fragile awareness that staying comfortable had slowly cost him something essential. And although he did not yet know what needed to change, he knew with certainty that ignoring this feeling any longer would mean accepting a future that looked exactly like the present, only emptier. As the days continued, Daniel became increasingly aware of how deeply habit had shaped his emotional responses, because even moments that once would have stirred excitement or concern now passed through him with little reaction, and he began to notice how often he chose predictability over honesty, especially in conversations where saying what he truly thought felt unnecessary or inconvenient. And this pattern extended beyond others to himself as he routinely dismissed his own discomfort by rationalizing it as fatigue or stress, telling himself that everyone eventually feels this way. Yet, late at night, when distractions fell away, he sensed that this explanation no longer satisfied him, because the unease he felt was not exhaustion, but disconnection, a growing distance between who he was and who he had slowly become. And he reflected on how often he had measured his life by external markers, productivity, reliability, being needed, without asking whether these roles still reflected his inner world. And this realization brought a quiet tension, because acknowledging it meant admitting that his current stability was built on a version of himself that no longer fully existed. And while he did not feel anger or resentment toward the past choices he had made, he recognized that continuing forward without reevaluation would require a kind of emotional numbness he was no longer willing to maintain. And although he had no clear plan or dramatic intention, he felt a subtle shift taking place, a readiness to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, to listen more closely to the questions he had long ignored. And this willingness, small as it was, marked the first moment in years where he sensed that awareness rather than action might be the beginning of real change. As the weeks passed, Daniel became increasingly aware that the life he had built functioned smoothly on the surface, while remaining strangely distant from his inner experience, because although his days were full and structured, they rarely felt meaningful. And this realization did not arrive suddenly, but emerged slowly through moments he could no longer ignore, such as conversations where he nodded without listening, evenings where silence felt heavier than exhaustion, and decisions he made automatically without asking whether they reflected who he still was. And as he reflected on these patterns, he began to understand that he had spent years prioritizing stability over sincerity, believing that consistency was the same as fulfillment. Yet this belief had quietly trained him to suppress curiosity, minimize desire, and postpone emotional honesty indefinitely. And what unsettled him most was not regret for what he had lost, but the recognition that he had learned to tolerate dissatisfaction so well that it no longer felt alarming, only familiar. And this familiarity, once comforting, now felt like a warning he could no longer dismiss. As his awareness deepened, Daniel started noticing how subtle choices accumulated into lasting emotional habits, because it was never one dramatic decision that led him here, but thousands of small moments where he chose ease over authenticity, silence over clarity, and agreement over expression. And he reflected on how these choices were often praised by others as reliability or calmness, reinforcing the idea that suppressing complexity was a virtue. Yet internally, he felt the gradual narrowing of his emotional range, as if parts of himself had been set aside not because they were harmful, but because they were inconvenient. And this understanding brought with it a quiet grief, not for a single lost opportunity, but for the slow erosion of curiosity, spontaneity, and emotional risk. And while he did not wish to undo his past, he recognized that honoring it now required acknowledging what it had cost him. And this acknowledgement felt like an act of honesty he had postponed for far too long. For a long time, Daniel had convinced himself that stability was the ultimate proof of success, because nothing in his life appeared broken or chaotic, and from the outside everything seemed carefully arranged with predictable routines, reasonable decisions, and conversations that remained calm and controlled. Yet beneath that orderly surface, he began to sense a growing emotional distance that he could no longer ignore. Not a sharp pain or dramatic dissatisfaction, but a persistent dullness that slowly drained meaning from ordinary moments. And this realization did not arrive through a single event, but accumulated gradually, through evenings that felt longer than they should, through interactions where he participated without presence, and through the unsettling awareness that anticipation had quietly disappeared from his inner life. And as he sat with this awareness, he began questioning how often he had chosen what was expected over what felt authentic. How many times he had postponed curiosity, desire, or uncertainty in favor of responsibility, convincing himself that there would be time later to explore who he really was. And when he looked back, he did not see obvious mistakes, but a series of small compromises made in the name of maturity. Compromises that had layered so seamlessly over the years that they became indistinguishable from his identity. And this understanding unsettled him deeply, because it revealed that a life does not need to collapse to lose direction, that it is possible to drift away from oneself quietly, politely, while appearing composed and successful to everyone else. And as this thought settled in, Daniel felt something shift beneath the numbness. Not panic or regret, but a fragile clarity, an awareness that comfort had slowly replaced engagement, and that by avoiding discomfort, he had also avoided growth. And although he did not yet know what needed to change or how to begin, he understood with certainty that continuing to ignore this inner signal would mean accepting a future that mirrored the present, structured and functional, yet increasingly hollow. And for the first time, this realization felt less like a threat and more like a quiet warning he could no longer afford to dismiss. As Daniel continued moving through his days, he became increasingly aware that the discomfort he felt was not something external pressing against him, but something internal slowly waking up. And this made it harder to retreat back into distraction or routine, because even familiar environments now felt slightly misaligned, as if he were standing just half a step outside his own life, observing rather than participating. And he noticed how often he filled silence with productivity, how easily he reached for structure to avoid uncertainty, and how rarely he allowed himself to sit with unanswered questions. And this pattern began to reveal itself in subtle ways, through moments when he realized he was agreeing simply to keep things smooth, or when he felt an unspoken resentment toward responsibilities he had once accepted willingly. And as he reflected on this, he understood that the exhaustion he carried was not from doing too much, but from doing things without emotional ownership, from maintaining roles that no longer reflected who he was becoming. And this realization brought an unexpected sense of grief, not for a specific loss, but for versions of himself that had been quietly set aside over the years. Interests that had faded not because they lacked value, but because they lacked immediate justification. And while this awareness was uncomfortable, it also felt honest in a way he had not experienced before, because it asked him to acknowledge that fulfillment could not be engineered through control alone, and that a life built solely on efficiency eventually begins to starve the deeper need for meaning. And as this understanding settled in, Daniel did not feel ready to make changes yet, but he felt less willing to deny what was becoming increasingly clear, that something essential within him was asking not for disruption, but for recognition. With this awareness lingering beneath the surface, Daniel began noticing how his relationships reflected the same pattern of quiet compromise, how conversations often stayed within safe boundaries, avoiding subjects that might expose uncertainty or vulnerability, and how he had learned to present a version of himself that was reliable and agreeable, even when it meant withholding thoughts that felt inconvenient or difficult to articulate. And as he paid closer attention, he realized how this habit had created a subtle distance between himself and others, not through conflict, but through omission, through the gradual narrowing of what he allowed himself to express. And this realization unsettled him because it suggested that connection requires a willingness to risk being misunderstood, something he had long avoided in favor of harmony. And as he reflected on past interactions, he saw how often he had chosen silence not because he lacked opinions, but because he feared disrupting the balance he had worked so hard to maintain. And this fear, once protective, now felt limiting, as if it were quietly shaping the boundaries of his emotional life. And in recognizing this, Daniel did not feel anger toward himself, but a sober understanding of how self-protection can slowly become self-erasure when left unexamined. And while he did not yet know how to communicate differently or what truths needed to be spoken, he sensed that continuing to prioritize comfort over honesty would only deepen the disconnect he was beginning to feel. And for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that authenticity might require discomfort, that growth might involve tension rather than resolution, and that acknowledging this was not a failure of character, but a necessary step toward reclaiming a more honest relationship with himself and with those around him. As these realizations continued to accumulate, Daniel began to sense a subtle shift in how he experienced time, because moments no longer blended together as seamlessly as before. And instead of moving automatically from one obligation to the next, he found himself pausing more often, noticing how frequently his attention drifted toward imagined futures or unresolved pasts rather than the present moment. And this awareness made him confront how rarely he had allowed himself to fully inhabit his own life, how often he had treated days as something to get through rather than something to experience. And as he reflected on this pattern, he understood that much of his dissatisfaction came not from external limitations, but from an internal disengagement he had normalized over years. And this realization was both sobering and clarifying, because it suggested that meaning was not absent from his life, but inaccessible due to his own emotional distance. And while this insight did not immediately restore a sense of purpose, it disrupted the numbness he had grown accustomed to, and he began to question long-held assumptions about success, productivity, and balance, wondering whether the metrics he had used to evaluate his life were simply inherited rather than chosen. And as these questions surfaced, Daniel felt a growing tension between the life he had constructed and the one he sensed might be possible, a tension that did not demand immediate action but refused to be ignored. And although this uncertainty left him feeling exposed, it also carried an unfamiliar sense of aliveness, as if acknowledging his dissatisfaction had cracked open a space where curiosity could return. And in this space, he did not yet seek answers, only the courage to remain attentive to what was emerging rather than retreating back into distraction or routine. With his awareness sharpened, Daniel began to recognize how deeply he had relied on certainty to feel safe, how plans, schedules, and expectations had served as a framework that protected him from confronting ambiguity. And as this understanding deepened, he saw how much of his identity had been shaped by predictability, by being someone others could count on even when that reliability came at the expense of personal exploration. And this realization forced him to reconsider the quiet trade-offs he had accepted without question, the ways he had limited his own emotional range in exchange for stability. And while part of him resisted this insight, clinging to the reassurance of familiarity, another part sensed that true growth would require stepping into spaces where outcomes were unclear, and this awareness unsettled him, not because it threatened his competence, but because it challenged his belief that safety and fulfillment were interchangeable. And as he reflected on moments when he had felt most alive in the past, he noticed that they often involved uncertainty, risk, or vulnerability rather than control. And this contrast made it increasingly difficult to justify his avoidance of discomfort. And although he still lacked a clear vision of what change might look like, he began to understand that remaining emotionally static was itself a choice, one that gradually narrowed his sense of possibility. And as this understanding took hold, Daniel did not feel compelled to dismantle his life, but he did feel compelled to stop pretending that clarity would arrive without engagement. And in accepting this, he took another quiet step toward a future that might be less predictable, but potentially more honest. In the end, Daniel did not experience a dramatic turning point or a single defining moment that clearly separated who he had been from who he would become, but rather a gradual settling into honesty, because what ultimately changed was not his circumstances, but his relationship to himself. And as he allowed the uncertainty he once avoided to remain present without rushing to resolve it, he discovered that clarity did not demand immediate answers, only sustained attention. And this realization softened the pressure he had carried for years, the quiet insistence that he must justify his choices, maintain appearances, or prove that the life he had built was enough. And instead of continuing to evaluate his worth through productivity or stability, he began to measure his days by something far less visible, by whether he felt awake within them. And while this shift did not erase doubt or guarantee fulfillment, it restored a sense of agency he had long forgotten, because he no longer viewed himself as someone merely responding to expectations, but as someone capable of choosing presence over autopilot. And as he reflected on the compromises he once mistook for maturity, he did not condemn them, recognizing that they had been necessary at the time, but he no longer allowed them to define the limits of his future. And with this acceptance came a quiet resolve, not to overhaul his life overnight, but to stop abandoning his inner experience for the sake of comfort. And as he stepped forward with this awareness, Daniel understood that meaning was not something to be discovered later, after conditions improved or certainty arrived, but something created moment by moment through attention, honesty, and the willingness to remain emotionally engaged. And although the path ahead remained undefined, he felt grounded for the first time in years, not because everything made sense, but because he trusted himself enough to continue without needing to escape the questions. And in that trust, he found a calm strength, one that did not promise happiness, but offered something far more enduring, a life no longer lived quietly on the sidelines of itself.